Washington was filled, the Capitol burned. The president's house burned, government offices burned.
Imagine waking up in America's capital and discovering that an enemy army is marching straight toward you. Now in 14, Washington, D.C. was about to be set on home.
This was the War of 18 between the United States and Britain. Britain had just defeated Napoleon in Europe. That meant thousands of experienced British soldiers were suddenly available.
British commanders decided to strike somewhere Americans would never forget. Not a remote battlefield, not a small town, the American capital itself. In August 1814, a British force landed in the Chesapeake region and began moving toward Washington. Their objective was simple: shock America by attacking the heart of its government. American forces rushed to stop them. But there was a serious problem. The defenders were a mixture of regular soldiers, militia, sailors, and even civilians. Against them marched experienced British troops. On August 24th, the two sides met near Bladensburg, Maryland. What followed became known as the Bladensburg Races because American troops retreated so quickly that the nickname became famous. Once the American defense collapsed, the road to Washington was open. An enemy has defeated the force protecting the nation's capital, and there was almost nothing between them and the city. President James Madison had been near the battlefield, but when it became clear the Americans were losing, he and his government fled. The capital was being abandoned as the British
troops entered Washington, and one of their most important targets was the president's house, the building we now call the White House. But the president wasn't inside. He had already escaped.
According to accounts, British officers found a meal prepared at the president's house. Imagine the scene, and the enemy soldiers had arrived instead. British troops began burning major public buildings. The president's house was set on fire. The Capitol was attacked, and other government buildings were also destroyed. The Capitol wasn't just a government building. It contained the chambers of Congress and the Library of Congress. Thousands of books were lost when the building burned. Think of it like someone taking America's national memory and throwing it into a fire. The destruction of the library meant could not simply be replaced.
But while the government was fleeing, one woman became part of the most famous story of that night. First Lady Dolly Madison refused to leave without protecting something important.
The story goes that she ordered people to save the famous portrait before the British arrived. The frame was too difficult to remove quickly, so the painting was taken from the wall and carried away to safety. By now, Washington was filled, the Capitol burned. The president's house burned, government offices burned. For a young nation, it was a humiliation unfolding in real time. And then something completely unexpected happened. A powerful storm moved over Washington. Thunder, lightning, and heavy rain struck the city, and the weather helped extinguish some of the fires.
Some accounts even described the storm as violent enough to damage buildings and scatter debris. It was suddenly caught between fire and a powerful storm.
The burning wasn't random, and demonstrate that its capital was vulnerable. The message was psychological. If Washington could burn, America wasn't untouchable.
But the British occupation of Washington didn't last. After the destruction, British forces withdrew from the city. They left behind burned government buildings, ruins.
Yet the United States didn't surrender. Instead, the government began rebuilding. The burned Capitol became a symbol of both destruction and resilience. The president's house was heavily damaged. The scorched stone was covered with white paint. And although the name White House wasn't yet its official name, the famous nickname would eventually stick.
Here's the strange part. Today, Washington is surrounded by some of America's most powerful institutions, the monuments. But in 1814, much of this same place was vulnerable enough to be attacked.
Imagine enemy army marching down today's Pennsylvania Avenue, passing the White House, while smoke rises behind them. That is essentially what Washington experienced in 1814. British commanders decided to strike somewhere Americans would never forget. Not a remote battlefield, not a small town, the American capital itself. A capital isn't simply because of its buildings. It's powerful because of what those buildings represent, became part of rebuilding national confidence. The Capitol was repaired and expanded over the years. The building that had once stood in flames would eventually become one of the most recognizable symbols of American democracy.
On one August night in 1814, Britain's army captured America's capital and set it government. But they couldn't burn the country and the city that once country itself.
If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more. Making these videos is really hard, but your support keeps me going.